Good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Slifkin. I'm a professor here at the Institute of Fine Arts, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's photo assembly. You're going to see and hear more of me in a moment, so I'm just going to welcome you and turn it over to my co-organizer, Sarah Meister, to introduce tonight's events.
Hi, I'm Sarah Meister. I'm the executive director of Aperture, and it is a real joy to be here with this photophilic crowd. We are here as part of something Rob and I dreamed up a couple years ago that we're calling the Photo Assembly. It now involves both Aperture, the Institute of Fine Arts, and the Whitney Museum of Modern Art. And our goal is to sort of initiate a series of conversations that center photography as a creative act and a means of responding to the urgent questions in the world around us. So with this, we want to foster a critical but community-oriented environment for reflection and learning, and tonight's gathering, I think, might be the pinnacle of what we've been trying to do so far. Rob and I are thrilled to be joined by 4 other esteemed colleagues, each of whom will be contributing to the forthcoming book that Aperture is co-publishing with the Eastman Museum about the Guggenheim Fellowship and its impact on the history of American photography. These authors include Emilie Boone, Associate Professor of Art History here at the Institute of Fine Arts, Sarah Kennel, the Aaron Siskind Curator of Photography and Director of the Razor Center of Works on Paper at the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, Phil Taylor, Associate Curator at the George Eastman Museum, and Leslie Wilson, Associate Director for Academic Engagement and Research at the Art Institute of Chicago. And as well as Rob, who's acting not only as co-host, but also author. And he, although he didn't mention it, is the Edith Kitzmiller Professor of the History of Fine Arts here at the IFA. I do also just want to note a handful of other additional brilliant contributors to this landmark volume who cannot be with us today. These include Aaron O'Toole from the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, who first shaped this project way back when with my former colleague Denise Wolfe at Aperture. So thank you to Aaron and Denise. Also the writer Rebecca Bengal, Tiago Nogueira of the Instituto Maria Salas in Brazil, Becky Senf and Emmy Mikulovicis at the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, our unparalleled research assistant Rachel Lee Hutchison, and my very treasured colleague Noah Lynn at Aperture. So thanks to all of them. So since its founding, the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation has supported over 19,000 writers, scholars, scientists, and artists in over 50 different fields of study, including over 550 fellows in photography. So, to get us all warmed up and to break down this very, very formal room, we thought it would be fun to begin with a few trivia questions, okay? So you can raise your hand or just shout out the answer if you know it. The first one's super easy. Who was the first fellow in photography, and in what year did they receive that first fellowship? Edward Weston in 37. Close. Good, all right. But now it's going to get harder. How many photographers have won more than twice? I'll tell you it's more than one, won more than twice. 8. 8 photographers have won 3 fellowships. This is no longer possible, but it was possible back in the day. Any guesses as to who these photographers were, these 8 lucky fellows who have won 3 times? No, but good guess. Dorothea Lange, not. Ansel Adams is 1. Helen Levitt is 2. Robert Frank only 2. Okay. Lee Fried, oh, okay, Rob. Chauncey Hare. That's probably the most surprising one who won 3 times, sorry. But yes, probably the most surprising. Eugene Smith, Walker Evans, Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander, And another lesser-known favorite, Wright Morris, won 3 Guggenheim Fellowships in photography. So while the Guggenheim Fellows in recent decades do reflect, I believe, the full breadth and vitality of the medium, this wasn't always the case. So who was the first woman photographer to ever be granted a Guggenheim Fellowship? Yeah, Dorothea Lange. So Dorothea Lange in 1941 was the first. And before Diane Arbus was granted her first fellowship in 1963, do you know how many women between 1941 and 1963 won fellowships? 2. And they were Ellen Leavitt, we just mentioned, and little-known Geraldine Sharp in 1962. Fun fact. Okay. So one of the most marvelous aspects of the fellowship is that artists are not required to provide any evidence of what they've done with their grant. So this may make it difficult for us to track what they've done, but it is a model of pure philanthropic support that remains exceedingly rare. Which fellow used their grant to purchase land? Danny Lyon. Kind of fits, right? And while we may discuss the relatively closed circuit of the fellowship in its early years, it is quite moving to read the references that artists have written for one another over the decades. So here is who wrote this about Lisette Model. Like emulsion itself, she is patient and subtle, arrogant and innocent. Her pictures are authentic and incorruptible, like rocks are. What she sees belongs to her. The time is ripe. She deserves her own challenge. We deserve what she can do. Who wrote those words about Lisette Model? Diane Arbus wrote those words about Lisette Model. So it is, so these and many more treasures will come to light in the coming years as we work on this book. And to emphasize just what an early stage we are in the thinking of this, we are asking these 5 brilliant chapter authors to begin with brief, informal presentations about how they're using the thematic structure of the book to approach the questions of the Guggenheim Fellowship and its impact on the history of American photography. So they will likely have questions for one another and for many of you. And looking out here, it's really great to see how many artists, both those who have won Guggenheim Fellowships and some who have not, to be a part of this conversation. So this is really an experimental moment. We are grateful to all of you for being a part of it. And following tonight's conversation, we hope you will linger for a reception in the Great Hall. The working title of the book begins with fellowship. And we are grateful for the opportunity to think through the meaning of that word with you all tonight. So thank you. Let's go. We're also not going to use the podium.
Hard.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean for them to be so hard. Okay, so a word about the images. These are a provisional selection. Is that okay? These are a provisional selection of a few images that may be in each of the 8 chapters, preceded by the author who will be writing that chapter. Don't really pay any attention to that. It's really just meant to give you something to look at as so that our distinguished speakers don't have to feel like they have to make presentations about something they haven't yet written.
So my chapter is about culture and counterculture. That's the theme of this selection. And for those of you who have read Raymond Williams' wonderful book, Keywords, he has a great 5 or 6 page chapter on the word culture. And he notes that culture comes from husbandry, right? And like you think about bacterial cultures, and culture has this very kind of divergent meaning. It can either mean kind of the apex of civilization, right? We are cultured people here at the Institute of Fine Arts. Or it can have a more ethnographic or anthropological meaning. I'm going to study culture. And I think that dichotomy is actually played out in a lot of the photography that has been supported by the Guggenheim, both in the way that, particularly before, I'd say 1980, when photography still had a somewhat contested status as an art form, winning a Guggenheim was a way to assert that the photographer was an artist. In fact, one of the letters that has been published, Lisette Modell writes for Diane Arbus, and she says, there are many photographers who are excellent, and some are good, and some are bad, but very few are artists. This is one of them, right? So there's something about the Guggenheim, just in the awarding, that champions or thrusts the photographer into the realm of art. And so there's a way that winning the Guggenheim puts you into the realm of culture. And yet, we all know that photography, and particularly documentary photography, and the kind of photography maybe that Evans is often associated with, has this other sort of ethnographic element, right? That you go out and you photograph people, different types of people, and often marginalized people, most notably maybe poor people. And so there's this strange dichotomy between photography that these artists are getting money to photograph people without money. That seems like a very interesting dynamic that is played out. And then, have we got to my images yet? Okay. Because I was particularly interested in the work of someone like Larry Fink, who decides with his Guggenheim, he's going to photograph people with money, right? So he starts going to Met openings and really sees himself almost like a private detective sneaking into these crowds to document them. At the same time, and at the same moment of his Guggenheim, he goes to rural Pennsylvania and photographs working class people. So that dichotomy is actually played out in some of these works. William Gedney goes to the true counterculture of San Francisco in the 60s to photograph these countercultural hippies, right? So there's, again, this kind of sense of bringing what seems outside of dignified culture into the realm of culture through the Guggenheim. There's Arbus photographing parades and rituals. My favorite photographer, Chauncey Hare, who uses the Guggenheim to actually take a year off of his job as a chemical engineer at Standard Oil in California to rent the other thing is how many people buy cars and vans with the money. This is something that I know many do. Hare buys an Econoline to drive up and down the California coast, where he then goes into people's houses and photographs them. So this idea of going inside. This is something that Arbus says in her second application in 1966, that the Guggenheim is allowing me now it gives me the credentials to enter into these realms that I wouldn't otherwise be able to enter. So there's something about interior, exterior that interests me. And just finally, an artist who, maybe an artist that isn't as well known, who receives a Guggenheim, Barbara Norfleet, who has these incredible kind of photographs that are all about these kind of social dynamics between the haves and the have-nots. So that's what I'm interested in exploring in my chapter.
Good evening, everyone. So I have history and politics, which is kind of everything, and so it's great as a challenge and an exercise. And I think that I've started by asking the question of whose politics, are operating in a given moment, and how to think about the photographer's relationship to any of the environments that they're entering, but also to their own personal conditions, to really everything. So starting from the question of whose politics, and then politics how, do I want to root this through a discussion of explicit advocacy, with different degrees and forms of directness, and that might look like protest, but it also might look like, the everyday. It's also about posing certain kinds of questions. So how are photographers positioning themselves? Everything from being in nature to being in people, and I really mean that, like being in people, in things and collections of things, in archives, in methods of reenactment, or constructions, or collage, or mapping, but also even as I think towards, this, I think what often happens, especially in, say, documentary traditions, this kind of divide between I'm here to study the everyday, or I'm interested in a certain kind of heightened event, or kind of the moment, a decisive one potentially. How to kind of avoid those kinds of binaries in the writing of this and make for something that is more capacious and more unwieldy. So this has been a lot of fun for projects that I thought I understood, or that I knew that I really have learned that I did not, but also for better understanding the mechanics and the constraints and possibilities of how people have executed their projects. Some of those are projects on the heels of World War II, so someone like Jack Delano, who was working in Puerto Rico, looking at conditions there within the grander scheme of America's colonial footprint. So what would the lessons be of World War II in relation to geography and territory? It also reminded me that I've just kind of taken for granted that Alaska and Hawaii are part of the United States, but they will not officially become that until 1959. So he's actually thinking ahead to the fact that this is still in discussion. That kind of, so what are the boundaries of the United States at that time, and how are they growing? Ansel Adams's work in the national parks and projects considering how people are using and engaging with the environment, and in particular sites of tremendous beauty and vitality, but also a lot of tourism. So how should those spaces be used? And this is what has really set my timeline back, because the file for Ansel Adams is so thick, y'all. It is so thick, and one of the things that's been a real revelation is about the photographers who faced multiple rejections before getting a Guggenheim, and the number, and the people who were rejected multiple times might really surprise you. So it includes Ansel Adams, and it's also the amount of times that certain people applied before they got an award, right? Which in some cases exceed 20. Right? So, and that, some of that discussion has been, well, I kind of use that moment to do the application is a way to call in my practice on an annual basis. Like it helped me reset and really think about what it was that I was trying to accomplish. But it's also the case that for getting lost in that material, I think it's that Ansel Adams is also trying to figure out how to use the fellowship once. He's asking a lot of questions about, like, can I use it for part of the year? Or I'm teaching then, and how can I work with this award? And I actually, at the Art Institute, I'm a director of our research programs. I steward fellowships at the museum. So I'm very selfishly interested in this process, because, kind of what makes for a successful application, but also what are the demands that we place on projects? And often to write a proposal, you feel like you're lying a little bit. There are the things that you want to look at or look for, and then there are all the things that you're like, but the whole purpose of doing the project is so I can figure some stuff out. Why do I have to tell you where the end state is already? So you're watching a lot of people really wrestle with that and think against, kind of what you see as the completed project. So I guess the few other things that I'll say, that, the projects are so wide-ranging, so thinking about, the work of Bruce Davidson or Stephen Mark and work that's really centered around protest. Mark Kletz's look at, defunct military installations and Nevada, looking at the justice system and carceral conditions and the work of people like Terrence Simon and James Casebier, patterns of migration and the work of Lucas Folia. And so it's really interesting to think about what the fellowship has helped make possible. And then also, in thinking about the proposals, I've been helped by Professor Zeynep Gerzel, who, in responding to something that I was working on around the work of the artist Ernest Cole and his own application for a Ford Fellowship, I'd really been reading that closely as like a manifesto. Like, you know, here's Ernest Cole's like theory of what photography is doing. And she had such a great feedback on that where she's like, I really don't know how much you should trust what photographers are saying. or it's not really what photographers are saying, but what anybody is saying in their application, right? You know, there's a lot of that kind of managing between here's what I genuinely believe, here's the plan I have, but then, you know, here's what I think the foundation wants to hear. So I think that has also been very helpful for thinking about how to hold the proposals with care and to try to read them critically, but not as gospel.
Thank you. So my chapter is entitled A Portrait of Our Time. And I have to say I was a little puzzled when I saw the chapter title and then the list of artists. But that was a good challenge because I think all of these categories are porous and, you know, we could do a lot of horse trading between us of artists. But the general idea behind this chapter really is one that it might be paraphrased as how we live now. Or I actually was inspired by one of the applications from Gary Winogrand in 1964, one in which he says, I have been photographing the United States, trying by investigating photographically to learn who we are and how we feel, by seeing what we look like as history has been and is happening to us in this world. So that's kind of my guiding post for thinking about how these are really a wide variety of artists are addressing kind of those questions, this amorphous question of who are we, how do we live now, primarily in the United States. Sorry, now I have to find my notes. And so in thinking about those artists, they kind of divided into three general rubrics or questions that they are helping me explore. And the first question is how we form and live in communities, willingly or not, and together and apart. And also how social structures, social, political, cultural, racial, overlay those and determine those communities. And these projects range from the work of sort of Wendy Ewald and Appalachia, or Mary Ellen Mark. And in fact, both of those artists used the Guggenheim to revisit these older projects. And one of the questions I also have is sort of the fellowship as a slow burn or as a retrospective, kind of, you know, allowing one to go back and deepen the work. In terms of slow burn, I think of somebody like Baldwin Lee, who received a fellowship, I believe, in the mid-'80s, and whose work really kind of, I think, has a wide purchase really only in the last few years. Other people like Christine Osinski, who were just photographing a community of women swimmers in Staten Island. The second kind of rubric or question I'm asking, and really this comes from the work itself, is how do we structure our lives, or really how does work, leisure, and institutions like school determine our lives, and how do we exist within those and against those structures? One of the big sort of key projects for me in this question was the work of Joel Meyerowitz looking at this project was looking at American leisure during the time of Vietnam. So also thinking about leisure as a compensatory mechanism, not just against work or school, but also perhaps in relation to those communities we form or in which we are existing. But this idea of sort of leisure also extends to somebody like Brian Ulrich looking at consumption in shopping malls. And then one of the projects, a couple of the projects really do focus on portraiture, which I thought there'd be more of, given it was a portrait of our time, but Dowd-based class pictures in 2002, that sort of thinking about that blends, of course, community and kind of the structure of school. But also Catherine Wagner before then, looking at the American classroom. And I think Chauncey Hare is also in my section. We have a couple overlaps too. So thinking about work and working class, but as well as Bill Owens. And I think the third question that these fellowship winners in this section raise for me is how we exist in relationship to power and media. That was something that really seemed to come to the fore starting in the mid-1960s and continue forward. And projects here include Judith Joy Ross's portraits made of the US Congress in 1986, 1987, one of Gary Winogrand's other fellowships. He, of course, won 3 times, which resulted in the project Public Relations, so thinking about media shaping photography, but also shaping culture. And then something like Paul Chamberlain's portraits of kind of the performance of power in communities. And there's also a kind of a thread of television as well through this section with the work of Lee Friedlander, of Mary Frey, and others. So those are sort of the 3 main directions that I'm exploring, guided by these photographers. And I think that beyond that, the project as a whole has raised a lot of really interesting points I hope we all talk about. And I wanted to close on something from one of the fellowship winners in my section, Walker Evans. And just as an aside about not winning the fellowships, I just want to say that Walker Evans applied in 1938-39 for a project on tenant cotton farmers in Alabama that he would do with a writer named James Agee, and he did not win. So if you have a rejection letter from the Guggenheim, you're in very good company. But in 1959, and by this time he really knew how to write an application. One of the interesting things is how, if you can see multiple applications, how the writing and the thinking, but also the institutionalization of the fellowship itself has evolved. He writes in the beginning, he wants to do a book on American photography. And he says, I address this book to the mind of the intelligent, educated, detached citizen, perhaps imagining him to be an alert, curious outsider who has seen all the trite, superficial, sentimental, or dull, dishonest, shop-worn picture and word views of the United States. And I was really struck by his calling forth an audience, an imagined reader, viewer of these pictures. And I did not see that elsewhere in the applications, but it made me start to think about the Guggenheim Fellowship as sort of a project for creating or reinforcing an imagined community of viewers, not bound by class or race or religion, but really by almost like visual literacy, by a perceptiveness about who we are and how we exist in relation to each other. So that sort of raises the question of also, with all the exclusions of the fellowship, what kind of imagined community that is. And I'll stop there.
Hi, everyone. It's really good to be here this evening. My topic is a sense of place. That's the theme I've been given. This is a fantastic project to work on. All of us were given, as you know, files of various photographers, and then we're given a theme, and then, we're told, okay, go at it, basically. And it took me a while to figure out what approach I was going to take. And what I've decided to do is kind of make one photographer kind of my North Star, the photographer that I return back to and thinking about the other photographers. And that photographer is Roy de Carava. So I spend a lot of time on his folder, on his body of work, and really trying to think through what the Guggenheim, the significance of the Guggenheim for him. And one theme that kept on coming up, so he received the Guggenheim in 1952 for a project that would come to be the Sweet Fly Paper of Life, which was published in 1955. It's a project he worked on. It became a book with images, as most of you know, and text by Langston Hughes. And leading up to the project, I was so struck by who wrote for him and the sense of community that was formed even before he started the project. These were individuals that were a part of Harlem, a part of the Harlem Art Center, different institutions, and ones that could really speak very directly to Roy de Carava's love of Harlem, his very much integrated nature of his life, his craft of photography, and sort of his aspiration. So this theme of community is something that really stood out for me when thinking about De Carava, and that kind of has spilled over in my thoughts to other photographers as well. Also this issue of audience, and so I've touched on like what happened kind of before the Guggenheim was awarded with the recommendations. I'm also interested in what happens after. Who is seeing these photographs? How are they seeing the photographs? What's the result of the project in terms of kind of circulation and publication? And a lot of different stories come to light. For example, Elaine Mays, who received the Guggenheim in 1991 and focused on Hawaii, spent extensive time in Hawaii taking these amazing photographs depicting a lot of the changes that are happening over a 20-year period. And at the end of her project, she could not find a publisher, so she ended up making a hand-bound a book that had an edition of 12. And we can think about the sort of impact of that book, even physically and materially holding the book, as opposed to one that is mass-produced and circulates. It has a very kind of different way of impacting the way we think of a sense of place, especially when you compare it to, I've also been thinking about Robert Adams. And I started counting the number of books that he has come out with, and then I stopped. I was like, this is this is so many. And also with De Carava, at first he couldn't find a publisher for Sweet Fly, Paper of Life. So these issues of, the work is done, and now what? How do I extend the sense of place? How do I extend this project beyond the project itself is something I'm really interested in. And then just issues relating to the technology of photography. We know Helen Levitt's transition from black and white to color was extremely exciting, this moment where she's really interested in experimentation. How does that experimentation and that deployment of color film then change the way we think of her photographs of New York City and think of New York City as a place? Same, been thinking about Todd Papa George and Passing Through Eden project, these very kind of quiet, still scenes at a very kind of divisive and charged moment in United States history, one where he was thinking about Kent State at the time, and I was thinking about the Lovings case, two major points in our history, which are captured photographically and photojournalistically, a very different way to engage with those ideas and the shifts, as opposed to what we see on the screen, a very kind of quiet stillness in which two people are completely integrated, their body intertwined. And then one just last point that I've been thinking about this, just this capturing the moment, and we can go back to De Carava, and just thinking about the labor of what it means to capture a place. With this photograph in particular, he spent really hours at the bottom of a subway stairs and taking various photographs of people at the end of the day, returning home, walking up the stairs, heading home. And he was able to get this photograph. He saw this man and said, I have to take this photograph. And he realizes he only has one shot left. And so he's kind of filled with anxiety at the time of, do I refill my camera? Do I just take this shot? And he ended up taking the shot, and it ends up being I think one of the most really stunning contributions of the project. So this also interested in the stories around what it means to really capture a sense of place.
Thank you. I'm Phil Taylor. It's a pleasure to be here and to be thinking about this project with all of you. One of the benefits of going last is that you have the sort of relief of everything that came before, and I think that's particularly apt in that my chapter title is Conceptual and Experimental Practices. So unlike the other 7 chapters in the book, it's not thematic. It's more like a modality, and in many ways it is what doesn't fit. And I think that offers a really amazing opportunity to think about how the Guggenheim Foundation has constituted a definition of photography and of art photography that is primarily rooted in the documentary tradition. And since this is really a project about an exceptional form of patronage that has really transformed and enabled a lot of incredible projects, to then think about like what the definitions, what the biases are, and we've heard about some of those types of exclusions that are sort of embedded in this history. And I think as my chapter sort of makes evident, a number of things seem to happen, and there's this sort of expansion and contraction that happens over the course of this rich history. One of the earliest, I don't have a slide for it, but one of the earliest projects that's likely to be in my chapter is Meister, who receives an award, I believe, in 1967. And it's really about the 1960s that things start to open up a bit for the possibilities of support for practices that we might describe as experimental or conceptual. As I again don't have a slide for this, but as I've been beginning to root through the archival materials, there's a really interesting observation from the artist Keith Smith, who is a Rochester-based artist, and he notes that essentially people didn't think of his work as photography because he was working with photographs but drawing directly on them. He was using sort of collage and montage. He was often sewing and stitching the prints to these other mounts. He was making photo books. But his sense was that people just didn't think it was photography. And I think that's a really interesting sort of way of framing this relative to this rich history that we're describing. But he did also note that he felt that he got the support not once but twice due to Robert Frank's support and his endorsement and an understanding that yes, this was photography. Yes, it had a place within this larger community constituted by the Guggenheim Foundation. And I just want to, I want to kind of hold that as my sort of guiding star for this chapter in a certain way, even as within it there's a whole lot of variety, and partially that's the capaciousness of the category, but it also speaks to some of the changing sort of institutional and art historical frameworks in which we understand photography from 1937, certainly through to the present, and I think it leads me in thinking about this chapter to think of all the things that seem like conceptual and experimental practices that are not receiving support. So we don't really see the Institute of Design represented in any ways from the 40s or 50s. You don't really see explicitly feminist practices. There's very little practices that deal with sexuality in general. After Di Carava, I don't think there's a single Kamwengi workshop member who receives support. Other than Cindy Sherman, who I believe I do have a slide of, pictures generation is not well represented, even as performance in the studio take on an increasingly important role in the projects that are awarded, I would say, certainly from the 70s onwards. Since we just passed by Paul Graham, who I believe is in the audience, so apologies for thinking out loud about your work in this way, but I think it's a really interesting one under this rubric as well, because it is a project that is awarded to support the present, the third part of the important trilogy devoted to America, and is really rooted in the street photography tradition, and much of the sort of broader historical dialogue is with projects that received Guggenheim support, but that then is expressed through a reimagining of street photography in the present, as the title suggests, in the moment of the financial crisis. So it's a moment of patronage and also a body of work that I think really registers that. But it's through this conceptual modality that it finds expression. So the same place, photographed in multiple iterations, 2 or 3 photographs generally, as is the case here, moments or minutes apart. And it is this sort of conceptual framework that grounds it in a certain way. I also just want to quickly highlight the Ken O'Hara project, which is on here. This is from his body of work that he undertook with support from Guggenheim in 1974 through 76 called Contacts. Partially, I want to plug it for our friends at the Whitney who are a part of this because they have an exhibition opening tomorrow of O'Hara's Contacts, which I believe reflects a major acquisition that they've done recently. But essentially, O'Hara would send a preloaded camera of his to essentially strangers that he found through the phone book and invite them to photograph their life, their family, the places that they inhabited, and send it back. And then that became the output, is the contact sheets from this. But so again, something that, in a sense has this rootedness in the world, but also in the forms of exchange and community that become constituted through photography. But again, it's this conceptual lens. So I'm finding this a really immensely rich category to sort of think about, again, as the exceptions that prove the rule, and that challenge us to then think about how we constitute photography in general. Sorry, we're all packing a lot in.
You can.
I don't have a summarizing comment for all that. I do think, Phil, it makes me think about how so many of the applications for maybe the more traditional photographers set out to have a conceptual project that they rarely ever meet. I mean, I think that's what's so interesting, going back to what others have said, that to apply, you have to say you have something that you need to do, but so rarely does it actually result in what you say. Or William Gadney also never finds a publisher for his work of the counterculture and makes an artist book, a one-off. It just exists in his archives. And so that what these works actually support, and this maybe speaks to what you're saying about the slow burn, that so much of this, the concept happens in the process of the actual photographing, and it actually is materialized in ways that are, that the photographers themselves don't even envision. So I think you're right to think about the conceptual practices as an outlier in that way. And the other thing is portraiture. It does seem like that is not something that many photographers claim to want to do, at least in the initial. I mean, of course, we have people like Arbus who take portraits, but portraiture as a genre is not something that one sees, I think, in the corpus of the fellowship awardees as much. So it's really interesting to think about this. The one other thought that when I was thinking about the question of money, you get this money, and now what do you do besides pay rent and eat, which, again, that's what everyone wants to do with the money, but you have to say you're going to do something else. And it does seem the road trip is this thing that you can do with the money, right? Or people, Lee Friedlander goes on vacation, and then while he's on vacation, begins photographing monuments, And so the road trip does seem like the one, maybe not obvious, but it's a tried and true way of spending the money you get that both allows you to take photographs and pay rent and eat. But this idea of, I'm very interested in the pragmatics of this, because I think all of us who have been on the side of applying for fellowships know that ultimately we're just trying to get money to continue to live, and yet no one's going to fund that. And so there's kind of a dynamic between the two. I mean, this is why I love Chauncey Hare, because he says, I just need the money so I don't have to work for a year, which is, again, what we all want.
And the Guggenheim gave them the money just to live for a year. Many in the applications, I would say there are so many where you read, they just say, all I needed was a year to not have to teach, a year to not have to do whatever it was that they did to sustain themselves other than making art. And I think that is, But we will open this up for questions. So I would say if anyone has comments or questions about this, we want you to speak up. But while you're formulating those comments and questions in your mind, I have found one of the more interesting things, and to the extent that until we hear other people's questions, to hear each of you, it's a good moment in the history of the medium to think about recuperative histories, sort of what has been overlooked or lost. And I think there's an element of that in this project, meaning who are the names that have been awarded this and forgotten, and what are the histories. But I think you can complicate this.
I want in the name of efficiency, because why don't you ask each of us, because Aperture and Guggenheim gave each author a list of photographers. Why don't you ask each of us the one photographer we didn't know about who we discovered through that list? Is that a fair question to ask us?
Done.
Okay. Just so we can, because I want to, for me it was Anne Noggle. Like Anne Noggle. Who knows Anne Noggle's work out there? Yeah, a few, but not many. I had not. And she was a pilot during World War II. There was a group of female pilots who often just did shipments, but then it only got to Guggenheim, I think, in like '86 when she was herself already in her 70s. And again, she said, it changed my life. It gave me that sense of credibility. And she went and photographed female pilots. It's a remarkable body of work, mainly portraits. I mean, she did other incredible work, self-portraiture as well, but 82, yes, it was a revelation. So that's my Guggenheim Fellowship discovery.
Can I say one thing, though? The one thing to know is that these are provisional. We're still working on this. So with all respect to Anne Noggle, she'll likely to be in, but we're still in discussion. So I just don't want, none of this is a promise.
Sorry.
No, we have slides.
I hope I didn't put everyone on the spot. I just thought it would be fun to do.
Yeah.
You can pass.
Yeah, I think maybe I would say David Weaver Wing, who did a project, I would say, in the early '80s on water management systems in California, like and out west. And I feel like I'm exactly the right audience for this as a project. But it also is like, kind of looking in and around the spaces. Like it feels like a very curious project, and it's a relationship to water, kind of what are the plants, but also kind of just how are people being kind of in and around these spaces. And he talks about one of the discoveries of the project for him, or something that kind of upended his expectations, was that he didn't think that people, the state officials would want to talk to him. Like he kind of assumed that there would be like a wall and it would be difficult, but instead he found a lot more openness in the process of trying to make this. And I think I really kind of loved that as a story as well, for the ways that, for all the layers of assumptions we might be making about kind of what might make a project challenging and what might make it easy. So yeah, I think it might be that.
So for me, it was Mary Frey, and I'm embarrassed because actually there were several photographers whose projects I was not familiar with. But I want to speak about hers because I found it so fascinating. So thank you for asking me to do this. She made a project called Real Life Dramas, and this was in, I think, 1985, 4 or 5. And she was really thinking about the impact of mass culture on the American home, but particularly on women. And she was photographing kind of interiors with television sets, but then also starting to pair them with text derived from like novels and soap operas. And what I also found interesting is that this is my section and not yours, but I believe it was in her application where she called out, not her application, questionnaire. A questionnaire had been sent to many of the fellowship winners, asking them to reflect on the fellowship and the impact it had on them, who might have influenced them. And she did note, that she felt that the impact of the fellowship and its tradition really had been primarily the documentary tradition. I think she was a little surprised that she'd gotten it. That also makes me sort of wonder, too, with a road trip question, how many applications and applicants look to who won before and try to structure their application based on that. Okay, so I better say I'm going to go on a road trip. And so that kind of gets into who is being excluded, but also how you shape your application to be successful. And, how do you enlarge the field if, you're also trying to do what people before you did. So.
For me, this has been a really great opportunity to learn about a number of different photographers and also learn about photographers that I knew, but I didn't know about this project. And one of them is Christian Patterson's Gongko, in which he goes into a Chinese grocery store in the Mississippi Delta that is about to shut down, and everything on the store shelves, everything on the wall has literally, as he says, in his interview, he says they've been there for anywhere from 10 to 40 years. This grocery store is kind of like a relic of the past, and it's on this project, it's on that grocery store that he bases his project, taking photographs like the one you see here, and also he ends up buying a lot of the grocery store items and bringing them back to his studio and creating like an archive, and then taking individual photographs of a wheat thin box from decades before. It's a really interesting project about the past and like having a sense of delay. There's also just Sarah, to kind of touch on your question about like who's your question was about who should have gotten a fellowship, and I know we talked about kind of absence and kind of on that way and absences, and you talked about Kamoinge. I think it's something I have been thinking about in terms of the Guggenheim and specifically De Caravo was that, he wanted in 1952, and just kind of as you referred to, the next African-American photographer to get the Guggenheim wasn't until 1995. That's decades, and we see these kind of, leaps over the history of the Guggenheim that I think we really need to make note of.
So I think, specifically for my chapter, the name that jumps out to me that I don't have a slide of, these things are all coming in asynchronously, is Sonia Landy Sheridan, who was making some really interesting work with a Xerox copy machine. She received an award, I think in 1973 or 74, and was in the Electro Works exhibition at the George Eastman House, which I believe it was in 1979. So the museum has her work in the collection and had collected that work prior to that, I believe. I know that there are works in the collection, I think, from 1971 and 1974. And I think I have some sense of some of the other biographical aspects, but I don't want to posit that here, and I'm sure there are other people in the room who may be more familiar, but I think that is one of the exciting things about a project like this is the opportunity to look back in, and I think, particularly for me, again, relative to my position at the George Eastman Museum, it's also an opportunity to then think about what the relationship is between these institutions that played important roles in shaping the field and their respective forms of patronage, what the sort of relationship was between, what the Guggenheim Fellowship was doing versus what Eastman House or MoMA or Visual Studies Workshop or these other institutions, Aperture, were doing, and to sort of think of that mechanism of like how the field constitutes itself. And even on the way here, I was sort of thinking like about this methodological question for us of like, okay, do the exclusions imply that the jury rejected people or that people didn't apply? And that's a hard thing to figure out. And I was like, well, how did you know? And so I was kind of thinking in my head, we're not getting the email blast, we're not getting the art news announcement or something. Would Aperture publish a list, or would there be an advertisement in the New York Times, or what was the public sort of circulation of who gets a Guggenheim in 1963?
I did a Wikipedia search for the Guggenheim Fellowship just this morning, and then I also went on the NYU library, and through the Guggenheim, through the Wikipedia, I found a citation for a book that the Guggenheim published in the 90s. So then I put that book into the NYU library, and I got all these articles. And it did show that, like, Afterimage in the 80s would publish a list of the photographers who received them. So I think it did exist in the kind of margins in the back of photo magazines. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's exactly, I mean, I think that's part of the media history that's really interesting to try and reconstitute of, like, we now understand it in these particular ways. So how did people understand it? How did that information circulate as part of their forms of prestige, other than word of mouth and whatnot? Like, I'm interested in that sort of archival materiality. Yeah, exactly. If you get and you're like, God damn it, Winogrand got it again. Like, sort of how that response happens in a way.
And if,
Well, I think, yeah, I think, so, so I think, from the very beginning, long before I was associated with this, there was an agreement between the Guggenheim Foundation and Aperture. And, it was a very generous, open approach. And but also it's one that really respects the confidentiality of the makers and those files. And that's held in, with rightfully so, I think. It's a very important principle. So we at Aperture, and this is, again, have been happening, Denise started this long before I came on board, have been writing to every single fellow who was granted a fellowship and asking for permission to access their files. But those files, even when granted permission, are still appropriately confidential. So I would say the Guggenheim has been a wonderful partner in this, and that, but the purpose of in my mind, the most important, there are two pieces of what the story that I think I'm hoping this book will tell. Yes, acknowledging these important exclusions, and I think these are exclusions that are not unique to the fellowship, but are really about access. Who knows even to apply? Who knows how to craft an application that might be successful? But overall, what has this model of philanthropy meant to the history of American photography? Like, can you point to what this has done in a I guess in a positive sense, but not in a naive positive sense? And then can you tell a history of photography through this that then underscores that? So I would say these, the 5 of us, or 6 of us, and a handful of others have access, an extraordinary access when granted permission from the fellows themselves or their estates. But I don't think anyone, I'm sure someday somebody will write the expose, but that's, I think what we're trying to do is to say, look at this work and look at the absences and try to say, what kind of, does that tell? Yes, Shelley.
Okay. I was born. I was born in the Bronx. Huh?
Even if you're born in the Bronx.
Huh? Even if you. Okay. Do you have access to who were the judges? Because there's a particular system even now in the Guggenheim about who makes the decisions, and when you're making the decision, you don't necessarily know the other people who are making the decisions and things like that. Are you going to talk about any of that? Because a lot of what Sam's talking about,
like in the MacArthur, it's in there. It's a little bit like in the MacArthur Genius Grant. You're not asking who those judges were, and in fact, the anonymity of that, while part of the lore, and I think it makes for fun, cocktail gossip, isn't really, I think you can read into this, and, having worked at MoMA for a long time, there's a very, very close alignment between the museum's
and
collection
Walker Evans and Robert Frank.
And you don't need to, do your homework, and you can make whatever assumptions you want. But I think so as to protect the confidentiality of the process, I think it's important also to just respect that as a piece of actually what's made this fellowship so great, and not,
but
as
also it does
imperfect and
answer
flawed,
Sam's question and
right,
the
as
other
imperfect
question.
and flawed as we all are, but
What I'll say though is that one of the things that we have had access to are kind of rejected applications for people who then were successful. Those are like very illuminating. And for someone like Marian Palfi, one of the things I was wildly struck by was that her project is so different each time. Like a totally different group of people. It's a different region. You're like, how will you do that brand new thing? And yet, eventually when she's successful and you go back and you look, what she did all of those projects. I mean, and so it's both really amazing to see what she's able to execute, but also what is the thing that kind of finally pushes her past a certain point. And then for Ansel Adams, in a lot of ways, I mean, he really was trying to figure out how to make use of the award. How it could fit, but also you learn the kind of relationship that he had with Henry Moe, and kind of who was working within the foundation, that, in some cases, he just seems like they were friends. And so there's a certain kind of dialogue that they're having, but then also one of the things that elicits, and I think it goes back to Phil, kind of some of what you were raising, is not only this question of what kind of photography, but just photography as an awarded category. And that's also something that's coming in later, that music is coming in later, so there's a kind of shift that's happening in the 30s and 40s, just with the awards into different fields. So there's, I think, that thing of taking photography seriously as a field, and then what kind of photography?
Yeah, I'll just maybe extend that to say I think that's remains an interesting question, given sort of recent awardee years. There are people we know who've received the fellowship who I certainly associate with photography, who've received it in fine arts. And so then thinking about the distinction that's being applied there, and if you start looking back through the history of the fine arts awardees, who was making photographs? And so then, what is photography doing there, and how these categories sort of constitute or exclude one another, I think is just really fascinating.
I just also had a more basic question. Maybe, Rob, you came across this on your Wikipedia page, but I've been so focused on sort of the impact of the fellowship on photography, but I actually wondered, it seems like the Guggenheim Fellowship could be considered on its own an institution of photography in the United States, up there with many other institutions, a formative institution, canon formation, all of that. To what extent has the Guggenheim Fellowship played a similar role in sciences or in other fields of art, literature, music? My sense, but I really don't know this, is that it has an outsized impact on photography, perhaps because the percentage of photographers, is relatively large within, the group of people who practice photography versus scientists, but I really don't know. So I would love, if there's this other kind of study about the impact of the Guggenheim on music or literature or science, it would be interesting. But my sense is that it really has a very strong impact on photography, just as a practice compared to its other awardee categories. But if anybody knows.
There's something really cool about this book. I'm so impressed you guys have the dedication to do it. It's so awesome, all of you guys. I would really My question is, what does it feel like to be selected to write it? Because it seems really prestigious from my point of view. It can't be that much money if it is. So, but really, like, if anyone can give a personal answer, like, what does it feel like to get asked to do this? I would so appreciate it.
Phil, we'll go in reverse order. Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I think somebody just said terrifying. And I think there is that sense of responsibility. And it's, certainly it's the platform coming through Aperture, but also the sense that this is an important historiographic document. And so we need to try and get it right. and the texts themselves are not especially long that we've been commissioned to write. So I think that's the other thing to sort of prime you all for. So yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's just been excitement to get into an archive that like no one has access to. And as an academic, I'm like constantly writing fellowship applications, and so to kind of being able to just read. So, what did you write for your fellowship application? Like it's sort of the genre that I have been living for a while, and it's just so curious to see. So, how do photographers do it, and what did these particular, extremely successful, famous photographers, how did they manage this kind of writing genre aside from the medium of photography, but seeing it as sort of a form, like a writing form, whether it's good or bad. But yeah, a little bit.
Well, I said terrifying, but and it still is. But I would say that every time I'm asked to write something, I learn a lot. So it's personally gratifying to expand my knowledge. I think also this is an opportunity I don't often get. I usually am very focused on a particular artist or show or just wall label, one kind of thing after the other. I don't think expansively about the field very often, and that is, a privilege and honor to just be part of a dialogue with all of these people, all of you, all of the artists. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely daunting. I would say overwhelmed, and especially because the subject matter is so different. So just really feeling like you're able to treat it and really think deeply on the different areas that are covered. But it's also been really emboldening because I definitely like a long season of rejection of fellowship applications. And then I found that actually the things that worked best for me personally were when I let my freak flag fly and just like said most explicitly and most directly what it was that I wanted to do and stop being scared about what I thought would be received. And that's usually when it went well. And I felt like that was true as I was reading applications, that sometimes in some cases when people talked about having submitted multiple things, multiple applications, they'd said, in some cases actually, and for my chapter especially relevant, they were concerned that their topic was too political and had maybe dialed it back at a certain point in time. And that as the project shifted on them or as they changed their perspective, that they wrote in a different spirit and a different kind of directness. And in some of those moments when I think maybe they were most charged up, that's when they broke through. So it felt like a real push to say, just do it, do the thing in the fullest sense of the word. And also that often if that then doesn't work, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your application. It's a question of where else, or who else might open that door. But it did make me feel like everybody should be applying for stuff a lot, and not be scared.
As someone who advises PhDs, I think maybe I said this to Sarah, but I always thought this is the ideal dissertation subject, the photography and the Guggenheim Fellowship, because I do think, as you said, that it is different than the other fields in the Guggenheim. It has a certain cachet that is important. So to me, this is a great honor. In some ways, I feel, yes, daunted because it is, I think, a really important subject, but I think like all scholarship, this is going to be a major contribution, but not the final word. I mean, ideally, this kind of project will yield future studies, because I don't think we are going to address the questions that you raised, Sam, and I think are important questions. But, you know, as Henry Adams said, education is timeless. Endless. Education is endless. So we'll continue our education in the Loeb Room. Please join us. Thank you all for your conversation today and for your continued work on this. Buy the catalog when it comes out. And we hope to see you at our next photo assembly in the spring. This is, for those of you who haven't come before, please join us and continue to join us, because it's the community and the fellowship that makes it so great. So thank you again.